right. There we go. I can see everybody now. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. A special welcome to Fran Riley, NLA's Executive Director, NLA members on the call, and a few board members I think I've seen who've joined today. For everybody else, welcome. We're so glad that you found this event. A quick reminder to stay in touch, and for more information on future events, you can sign up for our newsletter at newsleaders.org. And I'll also email around some resources after the event ends today. But I'm Rachel Wise. I'm the program director for the News Leaders Association. NLA, for those of you who might not know, is the combined force of what used to be ASNE and APME. They merged in 2019, and now we are NLA. Today's event is going to be focused on two incredibly important topics for journalism: trust and sustainability. For news organizations, we know that getting audiences to trust us and the work that we're doing is mission critical. We also know that funding is essential for our future and sustainability. Our host, Joy Mayer, will talk about how those two go hand in hand. One quick note before I introduce Joy. Please feel free to jump in throughout and ask questions. We would like this to be a conversation. You can use the chat to let me know if you've got a question to ask, or you can type out the question itself and I will jump in throughout and politely interrupt Joy and make sure that those questions are getting answered. Okay, now on to our host. Joy Mayer founded Trusting News in 2016 after a 20-year career in newsrooms and teaching. She spent 12 years at the Missouri School of Journalism, where she created an audience engagement curriculum and a community outreach team at the newsroom of the Columbia Missourian. She also taught web and print design. In addition to serving as a director of Trusting News currently, she's also an adjunct faculty member at the Poynter Institute. And with that, Joy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Really good to see you. Some of you I have trained and spoken with before, and some names are new to me. This is a topic I'm really excited to have a reason to dive into. Of all the sort of slices of trust that we work on at Trusting News, this is one that sort of carries across a lot of themes, but I think is really important to zero in on. As Rachel said, Trusting News has been around since 2016. I founded it as kind of a part-time research project at the Reynolds Journalism Institute when I was wrapping up my years teaching at Mizzou. We're now based at the American Press Institute and at RJI to sort of share hosting duties of Trusting News. And we're grant funded. We run classes and do a lot of trainings like this, and also sponsor research related to trust. And are always excited. This is, man, when you talk about needing research and sort of proof of concept that trust strategies are important, the issue of revenue and sustainability is primed for that. So what I want to do today is talk about some research first, what we know about how news is funded and how little a lot of people know about the funding behind news. Then I want to talk about the story we want to tell about our values as journalists and the value we offer our communities, and what it looks like to just address those things head on instead of hoping that people sort of pick them up as they go along consuming our content. Then I'm going to talk about three, we work with newsrooms over a period of weeks to test out strategies. And I want to talk about three of the projects we've done with newsrooms that specifically related to sustainability, subscriptions, revenue. And then we're going to definitely save time for questions and discussion. So I would love to hear from you about things you've tried, or particular things you wish you knew how to respond to, feedback from the community, questions you have. I'll look forward to hearing about that. So when we work with newsrooms, or when we teach classes, some of you guys have been through like the month-long Trust 101 class that we teach. We often start off by inviting journalists to look at the feedback they get from their audience and the things they wish they knew how to respond to. And here is a sampling of the comments we've gotten recently from journalists that relate to funding and revenue. What gets in the way of trust with your audience? So just sort of a general lack of understanding about and assumptions about the relationship between advertising and editorial or news. Editorial, by the way, is a really problematic word, because when it shows up in print, it usually means the editorial board, and yet we use it to refer to the news department. So one of the many ways I think we could be clear in our language. But this journalist said, the relationship between money and news is something people have a lot of assumptions about and that we don't address directly very often. That definitely goes through the paywall. Every room of journalists we get in front of has plenty to say about what it looks like to try to defend why news costs money. And sort of the direct, like lots of people just assume that advertising completely pays the bills still. So why are you coming after me? Why should I have to pay to read this? And just sort of the general idea that news is free. I can go elsewhere and get this without having to pay anything. So why should I come here? And then, the kind of most severe attacks and questions come about just the basic integrity and ethics, assumptions that there are political interests, but also financial interests behind the news. One of our newsroom partners, Politifact, has like written out ways to explain that George Soros doesn't fund their work and that Bill Gates doesn't fund their work, like really specific sometimes assumptions and complaints that very often journalists just don't really answer. We just sort of wish that people understood and move on from there. So that's sort of setting the groundwork. And here are some things that we know through some research, some of which we've done and some of which we collect from other folks. By the way, I am going to share a link to the slide deck at the end, so you can, and each of the slides has links to where the research came from in case you're the type to like to follow the source. So we know from user research that we have done that when we ask people, how many news organizations do you support financially and how much trust do you tend to have in news, that of course there is a correlation. And the more likely you are to trust, the more likely you are to give money for news. So it's, I think, important to start with that foundation. That does track across demographics. Liberals are more likely to trust the news than conservatives, and therefore also more likely to pay for it. And people of color are less likely to trust the news and less likely to pay for it. It's really important to think about the concept of trust and what that means. For news, I think it's important to remember that it is about, do I find this useful in my day-to-day life? As I'm choosing whether to support something, do I think it plays like an actual pivotal role in my ability to navigate my community, make decisions for my family, understand the world? And then also affinity. Is this the kind of organization I want to support? Would I be sad if it went away? And I think that one way that we like to look at that is the difference between effective trust and cognitive trust. So cognitive trust is the facts. And journalists tend to feel real comfortable with this. Like, I'm going to delineate for you the reasons that I am credible. And here, won't you please just follow the link to my sourcing and you'll see that everything is clear. And here's a link to the spreadsheet of donors and you can see who they all are. That's important. But cognitive trust doesn't do much good if you don't also have effective trust, which is, do I feel like you're trustworthy? Do I feel like you have integrity? Do I believe in your ethics? Do I believe that what you're telling me is true? Do I think of you as one of the good guys? Are you working for people like me? Are we on the same team? And if you don't have that, then telling people, explaining to people the facts of what makes you trustworthy doesn't tend to do as much good. So do people have evidence that you're providing value to their lives and their community? And do they feel that you are worthy of their support? This is why at Trusting News, we take an approach that combines transparency and engagement. What are you saying about yourself? How are you pulling back the curtain? But also, are you listening when people talk to you? Are you present in conversations about your work, correcting the record when people question your integrity? So when we look at what people think about how news is funded, there's some Pew research that included where their money comes from. You'll see in the bottom row there, how well do news outlets do with transparency? And, we do somewhat well or very well on a variety of things, but at the bottom here is where their money comes from. 70-something percent, 72% say that we don't do well enough in explaining where money comes from. We also know from a big Knight and Gallup survey that the majority of people think local news organizations are doing fine financially, which is just mind-boggling given how many people in my world spend time gnashing teeth about this and looking for solutions. But they really don't understand that, especially on a local level, that there's less money coming in, just how severe the staff cuts tend to be. We work with a lot of newsrooms around transparency around staff size, because it can be really scary we make ourselves very vulnerable when we admit that our staff has lost a third, gone down by a third in the last few years. And that that means that we can cover less. I work with newsrooms trying to figure out how to explain, how to avoid just saying we're doing more with less, which doesn't tend to be real persuasive, but how to sort of explain the financial reality and how you're prioritizing and what people are still getting from you that they can't get elsewhere. That same poll, that same survey found that when people are given information about the status, the financial status of the industry, it might actually motivate them to give. This was specifically looking at, the question was specifically about nonprofits, but people were more likely to donate to a nonprofit that supported local journalism once they had the information about the financial state. And one of the case studies I'll show you addresses that specifically. When asked if they pay for the news, only 17% of people said they had paid for news in the last year. But 86% of Americans think people should have access to local news. They think that they're kind of divided on where the responsibility is local, philanthropy, tech platforms. It gets even more interesting when you dive down on the idea of government subsidies, either local or federal, and what that would mean. But they definitely think that it should exist, which is something I think we can play off of. People take pride in local newspapers and local news especially, but the subscriber base has significantly gone down, which is not a surprise to any of us here. One thing for those of you working in local news that is important to remember is that the scary trajectory of the numbers about trust in news. I'm not going to spend time today talking generally about research in trust, but I do have a slide deck that I'll link for you that collects just national research on trust in general, and the numbers are not great, especially when divided according to politics. That conservatives are much the likelihood to trust by people who lean right, it just continues to go down. The last year's Gallup number was 90% of conservatives say they do not have at least a fair amount of trust in the news. But on the local level, the picture is a little better. They believe both in the utility of local news and in sort of the integrity, the ability of local news to give news without bias and to help me live my life. Those are higher, to be more trustworthy, to be more accurate. The numbers are higher for local news in general. So that is, we can take some heart from that, and I think tell a compelling story based on that about the value we offer communities. So this is a short link that you can use to get to the slide deck we keep on trust, on research on trust. It's like, there's a lot there at this point, probably time to edit some down, but we collect, just put in some highlights from research studies when they're done that address trust. So let's talk about what we want people to know about journalism as it relates to why we need financial support. I'm really interested, and I would love to see any examples that you guys have, either when we get to the question and answer point or in an email afterward, examples of how you ask for money. I'm very interested in what story we're telling about what makes us a good bet. What both the value that we offer our community and the values that we're inviting people to buy into, basically, and support. So interesting to do this at a time of COVID because so many examples of people needing news more than ever, but local economies tanking and the business side of news having more trouble than ever just when we're most needed. So we've done a lot of training around COVID coverage, and it's interesting to sort of slice out the pieces of what we're hearing from newsrooms that specifically have to do with money. Lots of people are feeling like COVID has been sensationalized, and often they assume that there's a financial motive for that, that if we make people afraid, we make more money, that we sort of enjoy hyping it up just because we like big news and we like to make it seem scarier than it is. So many news organizations dropped their paywall for a while, at least on COVID stories. And it's so interesting to see when that happens. And then when it's taken away, so many complaints from people about, I thought you were going to give this to us for free. You're just trying to get rich when this is a public health crisis and everybody needs the information. And the messaging around that is really tricky. And too often, I think the answer people choose is just not really to engage and to let the comments sit there. That's definitely not what we would recommend. What we talk about is what is your counter narrative? So people say you are sensationalizing COVID to make money. So what do you say back? A lot of times we start with this. We start with what are sort of the misassumptions about you or about your integrity or about your processes and ethics or your decision, how you make decisions. Can you articulate in a sentence or two what's actually true, what you wish people knew? what would you say if somebody, a lot of times our minds go to comments, and the sort of troll-like nature of a lot of comments, the sort of attacking nature of, say Facebook comments or something. So I'd like to step back from that and say, if you were sort of at a backyard barbecue and, a neighbor you don't know very well asks you a question and you believe in their sort of good faith effort to actually have a conversation, what is it you would say in response? If they said, isn't all journalism for one side or the other? Or don't you make more money when more people click on your stories? So isn't it all then driven by money? I think it's really important to be able to articulate both the content of what you wish people knew and to be able to do it in a tone that assumes a good faith conversation and is respectful of recognizes their sort of confusion and lack of knowledge. This is not something people automatically know about any more than people automatically know the ins and outs of what it means to run a grocery store or to work at a church. There are always a lot more elements than people are aware of. So what is the counter narrative? What is it you wish people knew about you? So number one is explaining how ads work. Especially during COVID, we were working with newsrooms on explaining how the average local economy affected advertising dollars, and how the fact that people click on stories or tune into a newscast, that's not like an instant influx of cash, right? Like people do pay to get eyeballs. And so advertisers do like it when more people see it, but they also want engaged users and people who click through on ads, and they don't want their ads to be next to COVID coverage. So like there's a lot that goes into how advertising dollars work and how that connects to audience size. Here is some language, and I have a Google Doc I can share where we have put together a lot of sort of sample language. So here's some things we've sent around to newsrooms. Are you willing to talk directly about where your money comes from? About 2/3 of our revenue comes from advertising and about 1/3 from subscriptions. Just that tends to make, if you're willing to have that level of transparency, just that can go a long way in helping people understand that what they contribute actually has a role, is not an insignificant amount. We charge advertisers for the ability to reach and engage with our audiences. The second paragraph here, our news organization's finances therefore typically reflect the state of the local economy. A surge in online traffic to our website is not likely to offset any meaningful decline in advertising revenue. What does affect our bottom line more immediately is financial support from readers. For us to serve you well, we rely on your financial support. If your budget allows for it, please subscribe. And always, here's where to contact us with questions. We're very interested in ways that this language can be used to reply to comments, ways that it can be on a subscribe page, ways that it can go on air, and ways that people can be invited throughout their experience with your news to hear the message. So WCPO is a script station in Cincinnati that we've been working with for years, and they write a lot about their behind the scenes. So this is just an excerpt from a column that their news director, Mike Cannon wrote. I've seen and heard people say journalists are salivating over the virus because it will drive page views and TV ratings. The reality could not be further from the truth. First, I don't know whether it would increase TV ratings. This was early in the pandemic. Until I heard a comment from someone to that effect, it wasn't even a thought that had crossed my mind. Our journalists cover the news we think is important for our community. We would never overhype something just to drive ratings. I think it's something that seems really obvious, but very often we're not on the record. This is Mike's counter narrative. This is something then, once he has gone on the record with it, that he can link back to when people email him and ask the question, that can go in a comment and a reply to somebody when they're attacking your integrity. It increases the efficiency of your engagement and your digital producer's time when they have sort of a written record. Like, oh no, we've said before that that's not true. But instead of having to sit and say, let me see if I can work out an answer here to explain to people, the boss already said it, there it is. So a column can be a really effective way to sort of get on the record. Also a Facebook Live or just a social post, clearing things up. You know, we often hear from viewers or readers with this question, here's the answer from the boss. Another element, another way that money interacts with news is sponsored or underwritten content. And I think that too often we allow there to be confusion about what content is paid for and where it comes from. At WCPO, they wrote about political ads and what they're required to produce and the fact that they didn't get to edit it. That those were just, you know, given to them and they put it up because they were getting so many calls to the newsroom about, didn't you fact check that? Or why would you do that? Or where's the other side? That's not balanced. Same is true for sponsored or underwritten content in print or on your website. We, as journalists, learn really early on to follow the money when we're wondering what is influencing something, who's paying for that research, who's funding that campaign. I think it's really reasonable that people ask who is paying for the news. I actually had a family member recently say, I posted on Facebook, I posted a link to some Pew research. And she said, well, but you can't trust Pew. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Why can't you trust Pew? And she said, we'll follow the money. She had gone onto the website of a website that looks into the backgrounds of nonprofits. And she was looking at the Pew Charitable Trust. And it was mostly progressive people, prominent progressives who had given money to the Pew Charitable Trust, which led her to believe that everything that the Pew Research Center did was in those interests. And so I, got in touch with people I know who work at the Research Center and got some information about sort of that firewall between the money. And I think it opened her eyes a little bit. I'm not sure that it persuaded her, but following the money is important. So we were just last week, I got an email from an editor at GeekWire and got her permission to share this with you guys today. They were looking for advice on how to share language around their underwriting. So before I show you this, let me show you this. They had just updated a page that's really thorough about what those labels mean. Not just what the labels would be, but what they mean, because very often we'll use something like, oh, well, here, when we say underwritten or sponsored, obviously we know what we mean. But we're not universal across the industry about what we mean by some of these labels, and having a spot that explains it is really important. So here is content that that somebody has given us money to cover this topic. And so this content is sort of, supported by that donation, versus this kind of content, which somebody else wrote and produced and is not held to our journalistic standards because it was not produced by journalists. So if your news organization has gotten to the point of having a spot on your website that lays this out, that's fantastic. But even more important, or equally important, is to send people there and give highlights from this whenever people come across content that does have money behind it. So this is it's a draft, but this is what they're working on right now that would go at the top of all stories that are sponsored or underwritten. Microsoft is a GeekWire underwriter, financially supporting our news coverage of civic issues. We have systems in place to ensure that money does not influence our independent journalism and that all articles are held to strict ethical standards. When you have a disclosure like this, a lot of times people will do the first part. That first sentence that just identifies somebody in this story gave us money, but leaves out the second sentence that says, but we allow for that. but the advertising and the news side are separate, and and what happens here would never influence how we make decisions. So I think it's really important to just have that extra sentence that says we're gonna continue to ask questions aggressively. I saw an NPR example recently where they said, we're writing about Facebook, and Facebook has given money to NPR in these ways, but we're asking hard questions anyway, which is how it's supposed to work. When it comes to staff size and the realities of the economic situation, I think it's really important to be clear when you feel like you can just be honest with your community. This is the Bozeman Chronicle, and the editor, when the economy was affecting the size of their staff during COVID, he said, we're adding subscribers. This is an excerpt from a column. We genuinely appreciate that community support, but our local businesses have understandably needed to adjust, which has meant a lot less advertising. I really like that he's expressing empathy there. Like, he's not blaming anybody. He's saying we're a local business too. And I know that this is just how it goes. And on our website, we've made our coronavirus coverage free. That's the right decision, but it also cuts into our bottom line. And to adapt to our realities, our parent company has ordered a top to bottom partial furlough for employees. Journalists are going to be working fewer hours. We would like to be able to tell you won't notice any changes about that, but that simply is not true. People working 30 hours a week will produce less, and there's no way around that. Robin Tomlin, I thought, did a really nice job with a Twitter thread, again, early in COVID, about historic readership. I'm so proud of my staff. Here's what they're doing. We're glad that you're valuing it too. Readership is up 300%, but it's impossible to make all of this free. News sites are shutting down. Journalists are being laid off. We can only keep doing this with your support. I think that sort of candor can have great effect and is persuasive. When it comes to the paywall, I too often see well, I mean, every day I see comments from people complaining about paywalls. Why should I have to pay for this? Why would you post this here if I can't read it? And way too often there's no response. So here's a sample response. I live in Sarasota, Florida now, and this is my local newspaper. They do a good job of responding to questions like this. You can read 5 stories a month for free. By hitting your limit, you clearly show that you care about our community and staying informed. That it just cracks me up when people say you shouldn't even post this if I can't read it, because like they've probably already clicked on it 5 times when you've done it, right? And they hit the wall and now they're gonna have to pay. We do charge because we couldn't stay in business without the support of our awesome subscribers. Here's where you can do that. Some newsrooms keep sort of a Google Doc or a Slack channel with sample responses for comments, just to sort of keep it efficient over time. I've seen some that include, an outline of where money comes from. The 1/3 of our budget that is from subscriptions. That's why we have a paywall. I've seen them that emphasize we're a local business too. Our employees live here, are raising their families here. This is what pays their salary. But I do think it's important, again, to sort of get clear on your language. This is your counter narrative. What do you wish people knew about why you cost money? And then don't be shy about defending it. The best is that when one newsroom we worked with, the Colorado and in Fort Collins, got pretty aggressive for a while about not letting people paste the text of stories and comments. That's cheating. You're stealing from us, and really aggressively defending the paywall. And then they notice their readers start to do it too and say, well, why would you work for a donation? Would you work for free? It can really pay off if you invest in that. This is a nice example from the Beacon in Kansas City. They said they've had really good response by just sort of emphasizing their role in democracy. So this is in an election day newsletter. Trusted journalism has never mattered more. And then the message that surrounds that button is the health of our democracy depends on an informed electorate. Because you read the Beacon, we know that you know this. Thank you for trusting us to deliver the news today. Please support the work. So how we doing? Any questions so far? Anything we need to stop and address before I show you some examples?
Nothing in the chat, but anybody is welcome to speak up if they got questions.
Okay, we will keep trucking on along. So I'm hoping that these will be useful for you. So what we do at Trusting News is a lot of training, a lot of classes. We take calls all the time from newsrooms like we did last week at GeekWire, just saying, hey, I'm working on something. Would you mind taking a look? For newsrooms that want to make sort of a longer term commitment, what we do is agree on some goals and set up regular meetings and sort of track progress and then help analyze whether something worked. And worked is squishy. Because sometimes that means, that sometimes it means more readership or just sort of better metrics. Sometimes it means that the tone of conversations has changed. Sometimes it means that in the comments, people are focusing more on the topic of journalism and less on attacking the journalist. Sometimes it means positive feedback, sort of qualitative feedback from the community. But so we work with newsrooms on a variety of transparency and engagement strategies. What I want to show you about today are 3 that tied in one way or another specifically to asking for community or audience support. And all 3 of these are things we have written about in our Medium publication. And so I'll share the link so that you can go deeper into them if you want. And just so you know, we of course never share anything we hear from newsrooms without their permission. So everything I have today is something we've published publicly and that I have permission to share. So first, Politifact. We've been working with Politifact for a couple of years on a variety of things, including, how to explain with very interesting conversations over election year and since the election about sort of explaining what it means to hold government accountable, what role that fact checking plays in journalism these days, and how you earn the trust of people who think that the media is driven by an agenda and it must be making things up, and obviously is funded by George Soros, as I said earlier. But the first real work we did with Politifact was a newsletter example. Let me just tell you that I love it when newsrooms are willing to work on their newsletters with us, because it's one of the simplest way to isolate variables and to do some simple A/B testing. So what we did with Politifact is huge thank you to Angie Holan, who writes their big weekly fact-checking newsletter that at the time that we did it, I think had maybe 80,000 subscribers. So what we did is divide the list in 2. Very simple A/B test. At the end of their weekly newsletter every week used to be this button. These newsletters don't write themselves. This content is free to consume, but not to create. Donate today. Super generic, right? something that could go with any piece of journalism, but is not, you don't learn anything about PolitiFact there. It's not particularly motivating. It's just like reminding people they're humans who need a paycheck behind it. So half of the list continued to get this. For the next 18 weeks, the other half of the list got a rotating series of value statements. Our fact checks disrupt the agendas of politicians across the ideological spectrum, support the truth today. I don't remember if I have another one. No. So, but there were maybe 7 or 8 of them that we kind of rotated through. Each one ran maybe 3 times. So what we were testing with that is clicks on the donation button fundamentally. It's nice if people also give. So we were also looking at whether they actually donated, but the action, we were able to isolate this variable. The action that is being invited here is click on the donation button. We also, in the text of the newsletter, added an extra section, an extra bullet point behind the scenes of PolitiFact. And so it was statements like this. What goes into a fact check? How do we decide what's a fact check? Carefully selected statement, on the record sourcing, a panel of 3 judges. We have been thoughtfully rating claims since 2017. And here, that was a link. You can click to learn more about our process and rating system. So the statements were designed to sort of pull back the curtain on their thoroughness and the integrity of how they make decisions. Another one was, we are independent and nonprofit. We fact check all parties. Each of these was a link. Negative ratings to Donald Trump, negative ratings to prominent Democrats, and then read here how we decide what claims to check. The way we were testing that was through a Net Promoter Score survey. So at the end of the 18-week experiment, we were able to analyze the data for the donation button and also send out, they were doing an audience survey anyway, and we just included a quick Net Promoter Score, which is how likely would you be to recommend this to a friend or colleague? And we were testing to see if the half of the newsletter that had seen no extra content and that generic donation button, if the answers differed from the half of the newsletter that got the extra behind the scenes bullet points and the updated donation button. And it did. So the segment that got the donation button, readers were more than twice as likely to click to donate. And what with that extra behind the scenes content, the perceptions of the brand improved significantly. I think the Net Promoter Score was maybe 71 on the first one and 80 on the second one. And that we checked across ideology too. And that held true for moderates and conservatives specifically, which is something we were very interested in. A huge thank you there to Josie Hollingsworth, who's the engagement editor at Politifact. She was the one who helped craft all the statements and just keep track of the data and that sort of thing. And huge thanks to Politifact for letting me just publish all the data. I know that not all newsrooms are in a position to do that, but I'll share the link at the end. And when you click through, they actually, I have the tables are in the Medium post showing the clicks for each statement and that sort of thing. And when we get to the end here, I'll be happy to answer more questions about each of these if I can, as well as just the topic overall. Next case study is the Coloradoan, Gannett Newsroom in Fort Collins. We've been working with them for a while as well. They worked on immediately with us. When we started working for them, I think in 2016, they got involved real early with defending the paywall aggressively and with sort of trying to explain their work in Facebook comments. They do a lot of noticing, on every crime story, people seem to have these questions. Why don't we write an explainer about how we cover crime? And then we can link back each time. So they've done a lot of good work over a period of several years. Over the last couple of years, they've been working specifically on how they ask for subscriptions. And they started with a reporter ask on every story. So reporters wrote individual sort of statements of goals. Here's why I do this work. Here's why I think it's important. Please support the work in this way. And Jen Hefty at the Coloradoan wrote for us in April about how these subscription asks were going. And they had led to nearly 1,000 visits to order pages and roughly 24 new subscriptions in those first few months of 2020 of doing the work. And she wanted me to be sure to mention that only catches people, of course, who go straight from that to order, not people who see that and are later moved to order, to place a subscription order. Unfortunately, also, we don't have more up-to-date information because their metric system changed directly pretty soon after she stopped writing this. It was something to do with Apple thinking that they were subverting their subscription asks within the apps or something. And so they're not able at this point to link straight from reporter pages to subscriptions. So this is the latest data that I have. But after they were working on those reporter subscription asks, They then started to ask more questions about which types of stories were most likely to convert people to subscribers. And they were asking questions like, who is the audience for each story? And at what stage of the audience funnel is the story targeted? How does that audience specifically interact with the coverage? And then thinking through refreshing, what kind of subscription ask should we be using over time? They focused on stories with the highest conversion potential, where they saw that people were most likely to potentially convert. And they also started to look at topical subscription asks, which is what I'm most excited to tell you about today, because realizing what questions people have as they consume specific content is a real way to show that you understand their mindset and that you're anticipating what they might want to know. And they just tend to do better. Just like with Politifact, the more specific you get, the more likely it is to convert. So a general sense of like, please support our work is very different than saying, I want to tell you something about this specific content. So they actually noticed on crime and breaking news stories that that's where people would very be likely to say, why should I have to pay for this? Shouldn't it be free? Maybe they're more casual readers, but they definitely wanted to know. So they created ads to go on those stories that invited people to subscribe. So I love this top one, help support our crime reporting. The Coloradoan spends at least $7 to $10 in public records alone to write each of these crime stories. I had never thought of it that way, that the simple background check they do on every story has a cost to it. I think that's really, really smart. For the price we pay to write one story, you can get a month of unlimited access. That is so, so smart. And those topical asks are performing very, very well, or were before they had to change their metric system. They have one here about city council. Here's why covering the government takes a lot of time. We can't keep a watchful eye without your support. Again, very specific. Probably the people likely to consume a city council story would appreciate that sort of being pointed out, that this is part of our sort of watchdog role and that it costs us money to do it. And then election coverage, here's what we have coming up this year and why we need your support for that. So in the first few weeks of COVID coverage, they had great luck with their COVID subscription asks. They did, get rid of the paywall. We're committed to bringing you accurate, up-to-date information on coronavirus in Colorado, but we also want to share the good things happening. As such, this story and many others are being provided free for all to read. Please subscribe. And those notes which were put on every single COVID story led to almost 2,000 order page views and 26 subscriptions in just the first few weeks. They also, as I teased earlier, were the first newsroom I saw, or the first newsroom that we worked with that was willing to get really specific about where their money comes from. And they said they really felt like it opened eyes for people to see it broken down this clearly. 60% revenue from advertising, 40% from subscriptions. Please support the work. So what they have to say about their approach moving forward is to remember that using the same asks over and over and over, people do get tired of them. And so evolving them and updating them is important. However, they really emphasize the need to be consistent and to put them on every story. I think that not every story, but if you decide you want to do something with crime, for example, put it on every single crime story. I think journalists tend to worry a lot about being redundant and annoying, and we see a message over and over and over and think everyone must be tired of it. But for all of our transparency strategies, we don't really hear from news audiences that they're tired of it. We don't really see people commenting saying, you told me that on this story last week. Why are you telling me that again? They tend to just scan past it if it's not relevant for them. And of course, people see a tiny fraction of what we do. So if you put it on just 5 crime stories a week, but you publish 20, people could actually read quite a few and not see them. And Jennifer Hefty is now a regional content strategy analyst and is based in Fort Collins. She's the one who's been spearheading their work with us for a few years. Okay, last case study. We're doing great on time. Last case study is The Day, which is in New London, Connecticut. We've been working with them for many years as well. And this is a COVID specific case study, and I'm really inspired by it because of how their newsroom really took on the challenge of explaining the value of the work. Jen had said the same thing about the Coloradoan, that she expected a little more pushback maybe from when reporters were asked to write statements inviting financial support. That can feel sort of uncomfortable. It can feel like a violation of the firewall, but I think when done well, it's just a matter of standing up for your work and explaining why it has value and why it costs money. So they realized at the day pretty quickly that their bottom line did not have a lot of cushion, and that it was going to be that they needed to do some pretty drastic things in order to keep money bringing in. So they created a whole campaign that resulted in more donations and more reader subscriptions, which I will show you more details about. So they communicated in print about reliance on subscriptions. They had some house ads, I think. They wrote some columns. They created a video ad that ran on local cable, sort of getting the word out in the community about why the newspaper needed support. They partnered, they're owned by some sort of local trust in New London. And so they have an unusual business model that they are able to talk about a lot. But they did form a partnership with LMA, which invited people to give donations. And they wrote about that and linked to how people could contribute. We're a trusted part of this community, the publisher said. People look to us to provide coverage. We need the support. It's time for all of us to come together to get through this. That publisher also wrote a front page column in which he really candidly sort of made the case of what would happen if they did not get more reader support. And that is not particularly comfortable or fun to do. But he said, you know, if you want this to exist, it's time to step up. And then they did a series of videos from the staff in which each person talked about what they do for the day. Here I am working remotely now. My job is this. Normally I might be doing this. And I would like very much for you to support the work. So I have one here from Peter, and I'm hoping it will play. Rachel, give me a thumbs up if the audio and everything plays all right, okay? No audio? I'm sorry, I forgot to test that. But Peter basically said, you know, in normal times, I would be out, I'm the director of multimedia, I would be out covering these things. Instead, I'm at home. Here are some of the stories I've done in the last few weeks to reflect how the community is adapting to these strange times. But my staff and I can't do this without your support. Here are ways that you can donate and subscribe. So in the 2 weeks after that column from the publisher ran on the front page of the print edition and on the homepage, donations soared from 15,000 to 60,000, and print and digital subscriptions went up quite a bit as well. I'm sorry, I don't have a specific number there. But the comments that came in were just like a huge morale booster for the staff, and also just really great validation that people were donating because they saw the value. The day is one of the many things that adds to the strength of our community. The day is an invaluable asset. We are lucky to have the day to keep us informed. Hang in there. Now more than ever, we need reliable and accurate news that the day has always provided. And this is Peter, who's the director of multimedia there, who we've been working with for a few years. So that ends the presentation portion here. Here's what I am really hoping you guys can take away from this. And then I would love to hear from you what you're struggling with or experiences or successes that you've had. I'm really hoping for journalists to, in general, pay more attention to perceptions of how your news is funded. If you're getting emails and phone calls and social media comments from people saying that some sort of special interest is funding your work, or that you're greedy by asking for money, or that you know, probably you're only writing this story because somebody donated, I really want you to pay attention to that, because for every person who says it out loud, others are thinking it. And it's real dangerous to let those rumors or misassumptions go unchallenged. We have to have a counter narrative and then look for real clear ways to share it. Be really clear in your labeling of any content that includes money. You know, here's how that works. Here, you know, advertising, sponsored content, underwritten content. I hope you have somewhere on your website that lays out where you get money, and including, you know, your ownership and any ethical considerations around that. Like, we're very clear to, you know, here's sort of how our operation is set up. And we would never, that just be on the record as saying we would never allow that influence to adjust how we cover news. That goes, by the way, for if anyone got stimulus money, like anytime there's sort of a government influx or, you know, something high profile where the community knows that there's an influx of money. Real important to remind people that doesn't adjust your news judgment. Develop a compelling narrative around the value you offer your community. Have real people on staff, not just sort of a brand voice. Tell that story of what you offer. And then as you ask for support, track results. Think about unique URLs. Think about newsletter A/B testing. think about how you can be experimental so that you can really see what works and what resonates. We're totally happy to help with this. My email address is here. I would love to see examples of what you've done that works. We offer free coaching with my staff, and then also 3 people who work in newsrooms and who we pay to help us coach journalists. And we do write a weekly newsletter called Trust Tips. Every Tuesday afternoon, we send just one quick actionable tip for earning trust, and that's where you can subscribe. So that is it. I'm going to take this link and stick it in the chat so folks can grab it. And I would love to hear from you guys about any questions you have of what you saw here, or any experiences you've had.
Hey Joy, it's Allison from Times Free Press. Very familiar with me. I had a question. You gave a lot of examples of people comparing their subscription price to, like, the public records. It's $7 or $10, and for that you can get a subscription, or it's a pretty reasonable price at $8.99.99. I think you know where I'm going with this question. But if you're a newspaper that has a fairly high digital subscription rate, have you seen any examples of people like approaching that with readers and maybe going against some of the feedback they get of, well, that's really high for a newspaper subscription? Like, any responses to that they might have?
Like it's too much money.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have any examples to show you specifically. I mean, what I would say is, however you can break it down to show like what that buys, like when you, like that feeds a kid for a month. That will pay for about, 2 hours of reporter's work, or, this many average stories a month or something. That, the more transparency you have around sort of your budget and your cost, like the cost of doing journalism, I think that could be helpful. But fundamentally, I think that if you have sort of a price point that does leave a lot of people out, that you can't pretend that that's not true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
What have you guys tried?
Honestly, not a lot. We are pretty well versed in the explaining to people that our reporters, we do want to pay them. Like, we respond with the typical, we've always paid for news. We pay for the print product. The digital product's no different. But I mean, I've gotten the phone call of, I pay $34 a month, or for $34, for groceries, I don't want to pay $34 for a news subscription. Yeah. And it's hard to respond in those cases. But we have not tried kind of like breaking it down and comparing it to some of the prices that we do have to, or some of the, bills we do have to pay, or things we do have to pay for. So that's a good idea.
I mean, that might help with people who just don't feel like they should have to pay, but could afford to pay. I mean, nothing's going to be persuasive for people who genuinely don't have that in their budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Marketing campaigns that are like, it's less than the price of a cup of coffee a day. So to kind of make it more palatable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. And there are people who can't afford who don't go to Starbucks every day, and that would be a chunk out of their budget. So,
Joy, we've got a question from Alec in the chat. He asks, newsrooms might fear that this kind of signposting adds to the workload and is outside of anyone's job role. Could you address who typically takes responsibility for coordinating these experiments and making sure the messaging is consistent?
Yeah, hi, Alec. That's a good question. I think it's interesting, when Jen Hefty first started to talk to me about their reporter subscription messaging at the Coloradoan, she said that she and her boss actually just sat down and did some quick back of the napkin math to figure out like how many digital subscribers would we have to have by the end of next year if we want our staffing to stay the same. And they sort of took that to the newsroom and they're like, look, if we want to all have jobs, we need to get more people to subscribe. And they didn't have as much trouble as they thought getting people to sort of buy in philosophically to the idea of doing it. Of course, it still takes coordination, someone to collect all of those, figure out where they go in the CMS, the unique URLs to track it. Often there's like a marketing or business side person who can help with like the logistics of the newsletter list and how that works, and production of the URLs and that sort of thing. Sometimes there's an audience person who has that sort of in their role. And sometimes it's just sometimes the people we work with at Trusted News are just kind of a motivated person. A motivated reporter can say, we really should be doing this. And I'm going to make the case for why that matters and just get a little bit of cushion in my workload so that I can take it on. So sometimes it's business side, sometimes it's an audience role or a management person, and sometimes it's just a motivated staffer. But we're always fully aware, my team and I, that what we're asking people to do is can feel like more. And that's just, for us, it's a matter of prioritizing. And a lot of times what we're talking about here is like the perceptions of our work come down to perceptions of our integrity and our ability to serve our community and our ability to thrive. So, coming up with, setting up a Google Doc with ways to respond when people attack your integrity, like here are comments we could leave. It's time to set it up, but it really does increase efficiency over time, because then you have something you can refer to and copy. If you write 3 ways to respond when people complain about the paywall, then it saves everyone time in the long time, because people feel more empowered, the message gets out there, and they're not having to write it from scratch. They already have sort of boss approved language to use. So an investment of time in telling that story can really pay off, both in terms of revenue, but also in terms of the ROI of the effort, the efficiency of the staff over time. But yeah, there's no way around the fact that this is a task that someone has to take on.
Thanks, Joy.
Any more questions, or does anyone have an example of something you've tried that you'd want to share with the group? I'd love to hear it. Oh, Jane asked a good question in the chat. Any ideas for reaching and explaining to people who aren't your readers or viewers? That is why I got so excited when The Day put a 30-second video spot on public television, and we, WCPO and the Scripps station in Cincinnati, I think that maybe they've done some radio spots, or maybe that's another newsroom. I think, but they like, their news director goes on like local radio a lot to talk about things in the news, and also to sort of get the word out about, here's the kind of station we are. We'll hope you tune in. I think that being present and visible in the community in a variety of ways is really important. I think social media is really important because a lot of people interact more casually with brands there that they might not even feel a connection to, or certainly don't subscribe to or tune into regularly. I think it's interesting. People get confused about which station or news outlet they're even tuning into, right? I don't know if this happens to you guys, but like they accuse you of doing something and it was another newsroom in town that had actually done it. They're getting you confused with somebody else. The relationship can be real casual. So I think the more you can inject this kind of language into like social posts, comments, responding to people, but even, the chatter, introducing something, or just a standalone social post that is about why you need community support, links to your mission statement, talks about how long you've been around, talks about the impact of the local advertising market on your work, podcasts, like basically anywhere you have attention within your own products, this language can be present. I think the Daily, the New York Times morning podcast, does a really nice job of injecting sort of language and invitations to support the New York Times into the podcast. I think there are a lot of good examples of how to do that.
WUO2 News just commented in the chat also. They said our public radio station launched a live stream series where we make the explicit, where we refer to as shareholder meetings. In them, we explain to listeners our financial situation and make the explicit connection between funding and capacity to report. We believe that has really helped develop listeners' understanding why their support matters more than just a typical pledge drive exercise.
That is really great. I love that. The more specific, the better.
Awesome. Silas says, you mentioned the Net Promoter Score research. Can you talk about the cost-effective ways to do that research in local markets?
Yeah, I mean, Net Promoter Score, fundamentally, it can get a lot more complex, but fundamentally, it's like including one consistent question in a survey. And so a lot of newsrooms will include this in another survey, in another kind of audience survey. So what I will do is, if Rachel's going to send an email following up to people who registered, I'll include a couple links there for you guys to see the sort of the details of how that Net Promoter Score can be used. And the nice thing about what we did with Politifact is that because it was A/B testing, we could test their exposure to different messages and different content actually, and how they responded. But in general, over time, it's just sort of a good benchmark. And you know what? Audience surveys can be real simple to do. I mean, SurveyMonkey or even Google Forms can give you a link to share. And if you make unique URLs, you can share it with a subscriber email list here, and with social media here, and through a community partner here, and see how people respond based on where they heard about it or what relationship they have with you. That can be a real easy way to sort of get a sense of what people think across different sort of pathways and relationships with the content. But it really is just a matter of asking a simple question, and then there's sort of some backstory of how that score is calculated, but that I'll include in a link to send around.
That's incredibly useful. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Write that down. Awesome. Any other questions? Cool. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much, guys.
Yes, thank you, Joy. Really appreciate this. Has been amazing. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Like Joy said, I'm going to send an email around to everybody with some additional resources, how to reach out to NLA, future events, and all that. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks, Joy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.